Welcome to BreakingWoke, how to identify, debunk, and dismantle politically correct ideas. I'm Douglas Kruger, author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. A heavy topic today. Let's talk about transgenderism and children. Now, I'd like to be clear right up front. If you are in your 20s or 30s, you are fully grown, fully matured, and this is something for which you volunteer yourself and your body, that is entirely up to you. You are free. It is your business. It is your body. We're not talking about that today. Today we're talking about children and transgenderism. Every politically correct topic that we cover on this channel begins with this idea of looking around at the politically correct landscape and seeing what liberals and people on the far left are celebrating as settled science and as obviously good, as enlightened, as the right way forward, and asking questions about the actual science, the flaws, the fallacies underpinning these ideas. Now, when you have people volunteering their 3-year-old children for sex reassignment, we have to start asking some serious questions. For some 65 million years, we have understood that male and female represent the formula at the heart of life. That if you want to perpetuate the species as we have for so many tens of millions of years, male and female is the formula. Today we're given a number of interesting phrases, that gender is not a biological construct, but rather a social construct. And there is a history to that idea, and it represents some of the most fraudulent science you will ever have encountered. It is academically unsound, and I will share that history with you today. Now, there are a number of things that should concern us just off the bat with this topic. The first one is the very idea that a 3-year-old can identify that they have been misgendered. In the same sense that a 3-year-old will tell you that he is a dinosaur, a fighter pilot, or a dog, you have a 3-year-old saying, "I'm actually a girl," and the liberal parents springing into action, glowing, and generally speaking, announcing to the world this new project of theirs. Then, of course, what has to happen is that they give them puberty blockers. They prevent the onset of puberty. Now, I want you to contrast that phrase with the idea the science is settled, or even just this is natural, this is normal. You have to intervene and pump hormones into the body to prevent the onset of puberty. Now, one of the things not being reported in the mainstream media to any great extent, but it's absolutely true, is the cancer rates of people being injected with hormones of the opposite sex. Now, that should come as no surprise to us. If you are a man being injected with female hormones or vice versa, the idea that that would very likely cause cancer should seem extremely obvious. Why are we not talking about it? There are several other things that are troubling about this idea that we are not talking about. Perhaps chief among them is the recidivism rate. In other words, people have gone through these transformations. They have gone from male to female or vice versa. They have surgically altered their bodies, they have pumped them with hormones of the opposite gender, and at the end of this project, have decided that this is not what they want and have detransitioned. This is happening in large numbers, and once again, it is not being spoken about in the mainstream media. Why not? Because the idea of transgenderism is currently politically correct. It is wonderful, enlightened, and to be celebrated, and the science is obviously settled. Another troubling thing that we've noticed, because we now have enough time and enough experimentation with this idea that we are getting feedback. We are starting to see that this is happening in social groupings, particularly among teenage girls who are particularly susceptible to group and peer and friendship pressures and dynamics. In other words, what will happen is one young girl decides that she is misgendered and needs to transition, and suddenly a suspicious number of her friendship circle make the same decision. There is something at the very least that should give us caution about that dynamic. Now, folks, there are many things to know about this topic, and I'd like to give it to you in as much detail as I possibly can. And for that reason, what I'm actually going to do here is to give you the audio chapter, one of the audio chapters, in which I deal with this topic and debunk it from the book. I'd like you to have it in great detail. But a warning up front, the particular academic research underpinning this idea that gender is a social construct is deeply disturbing. It is not well known, and my contention is that if your average person simply knew the history, the science, the experiment that taught us that gender is a social construct, we would disband this project not only as fraudulent, but as flat out evil. So a warning in advance, this is heavy going. However, if we are going to volunteer our children as the first generation of our species to think that we can make this crossover without issue, and as though it were a natural thing to do, we need to be asking some serious questions. Is the science settled? Are we doing profound harm to an entire generation of children simply so that we as the parents can look enlightened? Here's the history. If it's science, how much damage could it really do? Let us consider the specific issue of gender theory. An article appeared on the website of mainstream family magazine Living and Loving on August 14, 2019. It asked, "Is this the lifestyle for you?" The parents who practice this trend are described as forward-thinking. It cites a growing pool of research, quotes a psychologist, and then a study from the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, tells you all about the benefits of being a gender-creative parent, and then concludes with 5 quick and easy tips to raise a gender-neutral child. Doesn't it all sound so lovely, so kind, so inclusive? It's written in the form of a gentle invitation, which might be right for you. It's also very enlightened, so scientific. Except that it isn't. It is fraudulent and evil. There are many, many things wrong with this article and with this topic. Let's consider 6 of them. 1. The science is not settled, not even close, except if you listen to a humanities professor. Clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson observes that the social constructionist view of gender isn't just another opinion, it's wrong. He points out that to say there's no causal relationship is palpably absurd, and that 99.7% of people who inhabit a body with a biological sex identify with that biological sex, so that the two are incredibly tightly linked. If you can't attribute causality to a link that tight, he reasons, then you would have to dispense with the notion of causality altogether, a problem for science at large. Of the people who identify as male or female, who are also biologically male or female, Peterson says that the vast majority have the sexual preference that would go along with that, and the gender identity and the gender expression. These levels of analysis are tightly linked, and the evidence that biological factors play a role in determining biological identity is overwhelming. He asserts, "There isn't a serious scientist alive who would dispute that. You get disputes about it, but they always stem essentially from the humanities. As far as I'm concerned, I looked at it very carefully. Those arguments are entirely ideologically driven. It's a tenet of the ideology that identity is socially constructed, and that's partly why it's been instantiated into law, because there's no way they can win the argument, but they can certainly win, let's say, the propaganda war, especially by foisting this sort of reprehensible advertising information on children. That's part of the express intent." So, here's our first distinction. What do you mean by science? If you mean real science, then no, the science does not prove a single claim in this regard. It overwhelmingly disproves it. But if you mean that a person with a PhD in social sciences says it's okay, well, then we have a different debate on our hands. And, as Peterson rightly points out, it is not a scientific debate. It is an ideological debate, with a person who merely claims to be speaking on behalf of science. Science, here, is wordplay. Do you recall the opening lines of this book? In the beginning, there was a bad idea. Sadly, no one squashed it. It invariably begins with a liberal professor in the university's Department of Sociology. People like Professor Peterson are trying to squash it. Sadly, the genie appears to be out of the bottle. 2. The history of this science is so evil and so fraudulent that if most people were simply aware of how it developed, they would abandon this idea. Meet John Money, one of the most evil and fraudulent scientists ever to cause societal-level damage to humanity. His starting hypothesis was what we hear today as settled fact. Namely, sex is biological, but gender can be socially conditioned. It is a social construct. Money attempted to test this theory, which he pulled from thin air, using an actual baby boy. The baby, one David Reimer, was the victim of a botched circumcision. Baby David's penis was burnt off in the procedure. John Money and the parents conspired to use this child as a test subject for his theory that a boy, any boy, could be raised as a girl. David's testicles were removed. He was put into a dress, which he ripped off the first few times, until he realized that his parents insisted, and so he continued wearing it under duress. They then raised him as a girl, renaming him Brenda. David, or Brenda, had a twin brother, which maximized the experimental efficacy of the trial. As part of the treatment, John Money had the two children interact in sexual ways with one another. Yes, you read that correctly. And pose in provocative sexual positions in order to teach them the appropriate sexual modeling. Money injected the boy with female hormones in order to make him more feminine. He also tried to force the little boy to urinate sitting down, something the boy refused to do. The experiment was a disaster. It simply didn't work. Yet it was reported by Money as a great success and lauded as a breakthrough by the radical, leftist, academic community. Yet at no point did David feel like he was a girl. He described himself as being unhappy with his Barbie dolls and wanting to play with his brother's masculine toys. Why? Because he was a boy. David was, in every way, deeply unhappy with his female persona. At around the age of 15, after finally learning his own past, he told his parents that he wanted to go back to living as a boy. Watch documentaries of these parents talking about this, and you will see the father sincerely recalling how he asked Brenda if he was absolutely sure he wanted to make this change. Change. The boy was a boy all along. He had to endure forced sexual encounters with his own brother in a feminine role in order to make him Brenda in the first place. This bizarre case is still why gender theory exists in academia today. It remains the cornerstone of the entire argument and the founding of the statement, gender is a social construct. How did this all turn out? David's brother, Brian, became schizophrenic, overdosed on pills, and died. David later killed himself by blowing off the top of his head with a sort of shotgun. This is the controlled test case upon which the theory of gender as a social construct is based. This is its genesis and remains its founding and primary argument. Postmodernist author Judith Butler cites John Money in her book Gender Trouble. The now accepted gender as a social construct, or gender as a free-floating artifice finding, gets baked into each new progressive academic book, and so the ideas have continued to be piled on top of this evil and fraudulent edifice, as though its founding instance were actually true. As we have already seen, quite arguably, the most horrifying aspect of this new trend is that when children do display signs of gender dysphoria early on, it usually disappears as they get older. That is, except if virtue-signaling liberals insist on forcing the issue by injecting their children with hormones that prevent the onset of puberty. How is that not child abuse? And then surgically and irreversibly mutilating their genitalia. After all that, it is permanent and can't go away. Yet in many cases, it would have gone away, resolving itself if merely left alone. The science is now showing that the vast majority of children simply grow out of gender dysphoria tendencies if left to do so, with some studies showing a 94% desistance rate. By definition, this means that most gender-reassigned children were wrongly mutilated and wrongly committed to this course. Again, I pose the question, knowing this, how are these acts not classified as child abuse? There are plenty of doctors, physicians, and pediatricians who would respond, they should be. So why don't doctors oppose it? Or why don't they do so more aggressively? What happens when genuine scientists and ethical doctors, who are not duped by progressive ideology, point out the problems? Dr. Jordan Peterson became world famous for refusing to toe the line on politically correct usage of pronouns. That already speaks volumes. Dr. Kenneth Zucker longtime editor-in-chief of the Archives of Sexual Behavior and psychologist-in-chief at Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, studied and worked with gender-confused children for years. Zucker and a team of researchers found that of the 25 girls they treated for gender confusion, only 3 still had gender identity disorder later in life. For this, he came under fire from the LGBTQ community. He was fired from his job. His clinic was shut down. Political correctness won out by sheer bullying. The truth must not be allowed, not even in science. But don't actual brain scans show differences? No. The biggest meta-study of all the data on this topic, conducted by Lawrence Meyer and Paul McHugh and published in 2016, which combined the results of all studies and insights into mental difference or distinction, found inconclusive evidence and mixed findings concerning the brains of transgender adults. They described the results as conflicting and confusing, and not confirming. So, no, the science is not settled. Right now, the science is not saying anything. One of John Money's acolytes once claimed to have found a gene variant that supposedly determined transgenderism. Since then, there have been dozens of studies purporting to find that transgenderism is in the brain, or that it is to be found in the genes. This is precisely the same as the ongoing attempts to find an elusive, read non-existent, gay gene. If you care for a little more detail, Meyer and McHugh also point out that none of these studies are methodologically sound. None of the studies are serial, longitudinal, or perspective. They are all simply snapshots in time taken of small groups that may or may not have any relationship to the larger population. These studies are on tiny numbers of people. They don't look at their subjects at regular intervals using the same criteria over the lifetime of the subject. The fact that there may be a difference in brain functioning or morphology at one moment in time does not prove innateness or causality. All observed differences beg the question: are these distinctions the cause of transgenderism or the results of it? These people are generally taking hormones, behaving in scripted, gendered ways, and so forth. The brain is plastic and will respond to these conditioning stimuli. Just as London cab drivers' brains are physically altered by their profession, are transgendered people changing their own brains? Probably. And even if not, the results are still conflicting and confusing. Meyer and McHugh conclude that the claims of certitude made by transgender advocates cannot be supported with any scientific rigor. The consensus of scientific evidence overwhelmingly supports the proposition that a physically and developmentally normal boy or girl is indeed what he or she appears to be at birth. In Fake Science, Austin Ruse points out that so-called conclusive findings presented at grade schools and on TV are ideological journalism masquerading as science, and that these misinterpretations are damaging. Here, the title of this book applies. Political correctness certainly does more harm than good. To this day, the trans suicide rate is off the charts. Just shy of 50% of trans people try to or successfully do take their own lives. This is why gender dysphoria was classified as a mental disorder in the first place. These stats have not changed. So why is gender dysphoria no longer a mental disorder? Because it is not politically correct to say so. Leftists put pressure on the World Health Organization, who, in turn, declassified it. When people say, it's science, there is the science on which gender fluidity is built. Child abuse that led to suicide. I think the best debate technique is to have them look at their own evil. Recount the story of John Money. It is worth noting, even the debauched and child-abusing Money nevertheless still believed there were only 2 genders, which he took to be interchangeable. On top of his flawed science, gender theorists have now posited infinite numbers of genders. These are the imaginary constructs of ideologues in social studies departments. They bear no semblance to science, and when people call it science, they should immediately be called out for their false claim. The left, in this instance, is the party of pseudoscience. The human argument that they will present here is that the ends justify the means. Breaking down gender barriers makes it all worth it, even if this isn't science. Curiously, this kindness does not cause the trans suicide rate to go away. Key learning? The hypothesis fails. Forcing people to go against their biological gender in a case study resulted in suicide. People who go down this route today overwhelmingly commit suicide. Could there be something intrinsically important to a young girl about being taught to be a girl? Could there be something intrinsically valuable, even critical, to a young boy about being taught to be a boy? For millennia, we've known the answer to be yes. Now, faced with the opportunity to invite a 50% suicide rate into our children's lives, we glibly say no and run the counter-natural experiment on a societal level with our children as the guinea pigs. Parents gladly volunteer their children for these experiments because it earns them social righteousness points among their liberal fellows. They are not even stopping to entertain the question, at what cost? Largely because the science is settled. If you will forgive a digression into personally felt emotion, may God have mercy on our souls. Debate tip. When doe-eyed parents mention that they plan to raise a child genderless, your immediate response should be, aren't you worried about the suicide rate? Response, what do you mean? Well, do you know the history behind the idea that gender is a social construct? This takes you straight to telling the John Money story, which leads into the suicide of his subjects, which was the study upon which the science was settled. This then leads into the suicide stats in general. End with the challenge. What if there is something intrinsically important about teaching boys to be boys and girls to be girls? And what if failure to teach it leads to increased suicide rates, which all evidence shows is the case? What if denying maleness cues to boys and female cues to girls is deeply damaging to them, a denial of a fundamental psychological and physiological need, like denying them milk in their formative years? What if the human mammal requires this input? Why would you want to mess around with that? 3. The logic is emotional. But my son feels like he is a woman. How does he know, having never actually been a woman? Also, what does it feel like to be a woman? Is there a measure? Show it to me. It is circular reasoning to say that he knows what it feels like to feel like a woman because he feels like one. When the left props up this idea, are they assuming that certain feelings are feminine? Perhaps softer feelings, such as those of kindness or nurturing. Does that reasoning not fall afoul of their own desire not to perpetuate gender stereotypes? And how do we arrive at the conclusion that a male cannot feel kindness or nurturing or any other feeling stereotypically deemed female? Has science proven that men's emotional range cannot accommodate such feelings? If gender is an artificial construct, then there can be no such thing as what it feels like to be a woman, because they have dismissed that possibility as made up. Here is an important contradiction for the leftist. If maleness or femaleness is not biologically determined, not genetically determined, not chromosomally determined, and not determined by sex, then what on earth is a man or a woman anyway? A set of made-up feelings? But that can't be the answer, because those are subjective, and they themselves argue that they are artificial constructs of society. So now we are left with no such thing as a woman. Yet clearly there is such a thing as a woman. The answer to the riddle is easy once you dismiss the stupidity and return to the truth. A woman is a biological female with 2 X chromosomes and female genitalia. A man is a biological male with XY chromosomes and male genitalia. And as for the subjective feelings, those are called feelings. At the age of 2, my son thought he was a dinosaur. He told me he was a dinosaur. He roared loudly and acted the role of a dinosaur. He was also wrong. The claim is imaginary. 4. The science is not showing that this is a good idea. Rather, your generation of children are the guinea pigs. We will find out in a decade or two whether this unnatural gamble with your child's development returns dreadful and lasting results. 5. The child is being denied a choice. Goodness, how terrible. Yet when we know what is right for a child, we never give the child a choice. My infant son would like to drive my car. The answer is no. That's called being a parent. Children don't get to choose what they eat or when. They don't get to choose the language they must speak. They poop themselves uncontrollably and we clean them up. Helping a baby to develop and to become what correctly becomes of 99.7% of people is not abusive. It is correct. Instead, to train a child away from what constitutes normalcy for 99.7% of people in favor of a 0.3% margin is abnormal. And that 0.3% margin? Up until 2019, the scientific community regarded them as having a mental condition called gender dysphoria. What changed? Public pressure from politically correct activists. Did reality change? No. Did biology change? No. Did politics change? Ah, now we're on to something. 6. Categories are of paramount importance to the biblical deity. Dennis Prager repeatedly illustrates in his The Rational Bible set of books that God is extremely interested in categorization and distinction, night from day, male from female, life from death, good from bad, clean from unclean, and many more. For the Christian parent considering these issues, it is important to take the time to familiarize yourself with the nature and prescriptions of your own God. To him, categories matter, and for important reasons. If you enjoyed this sort of content, please subscribe, please feel free to share these videos, and please do hit the notifications bell so that you will be alerted every time a new video becomes available. I'm Douglas Kruger, author of the global new book, Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good.